Welcome to this civic engagement event. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rafael Fierro. I teach history and government here at Tunxus, and I also founded the Civic Engagement Institute almost 2 years ago. It's an organization that's devoted to having our students be more committed to civic activities, to get involved in their communities. I think some of you are here through your courses because your professors wanted you to be here to get another kind of layer to your work. One of the things we do, by the way, is we offer a civic engagement certificate of 18 credits. If you are interested in it, you should come talk to me. I have a card in my office across the way that I could give you. But it's an 18-credit certificate made up of 5 courses, such as American government, principles of sociology, and it ends with an internship of 3 credits. It could be turned into an independent study as well, and that is a paid independent study or internship. And we are in the process of getting a few people started with that this semester, but that's going to continue next fall and indefinitely after that. So if you're interested in that, come talk to me. We have a couple of students here who are doing it right now. Anyway, so today we decided that we were going to put on an event on mass shootings in America from a cultural perspective. So we're not looking at it from an emotional point of view. We're not looking at it from the point of view of gun control necessarily or mental health. But I wanted to give you an historical, cultural view of it, just to give you a broader explanation. Now, having said that, let me just say that this is a deeply emotional issue. Today's February 14th. It's the anniversary of what? What's that? That's right. So the Parkland shooting. And so it kind of invites that level of emotion. We understand the tragedy that's involved in these kinds of shootings. They're horrific, almost beyond words. It's not even worth having a presentation on the emotional part of it because it's just so deep. I can't even imagine what the family members and the victims go through when they experience this kind of an ordeal, right? And of course, it seems to happen very often in our society with increasing frequency. And that's one of the reasons why I do want to talk about it, because it's become a thing. It's become a phenomenon in our society, and as a result, it's worth talking about from a civic engagement perspective. What can we do? How do we think of this event in a way that can maybe make things better, maybe have these things happen less frequently? So that's what I want to really discuss today. Now, I want to begin with a bit of an experiment, okay? How many of you have heard of Adam Lanza? Raise your hands. Nicholas Cruz, raise your hands, okay. Dylan Klebold, okay. More people know Dylan Klebold than Nicholas Cruz, even though Dylan Klebold was one of the perpetrators of the Columbine shooting, which took place 20 years ago. And yet Nicholas Cruz was the perpetrator of a Parkland shooting, right? So though he's recent, not as many people know him as Klebold. And that's one of the points I want to make. Columbine really took things in a different direction for a variety of cultural reasons. So we're going to look at that. But how many of you know Nicholas Dworet? Show of hands. Grace McDonald? How about Charlotte Bacon? Not one of you know any of the three. You know they are the victims of one of the shootings or another. So I think it says it all, really. We can stop right here because really we don't pay homage to the victims as much as we are fascinated by the perpetrators of the crime. And I think that in and of itself is a bit of a tragedy that we need to work on as a people, as a culture. Now, I would say that one of the things that makes mass shootings front and center in our society is the impact that the media has on our thinking. And these headlines are very common. If you read the newspapers, if you watch cable news, or even the 3 main television channels, the local channels, mass shootings increasing and pose most serious threat in U.S. Expert says. I highlighted that in red because when an expert says it, of course, it's true. At least 59 people have been killed as a result of mass shootings this year, and this was for 2018. This is from ABC News. And of course, another CNN in 2018, there has been an average of one school shooting, accidental or intentional, every week. Makes it sound like it's an epidemic, and to some extent, maybe it is. I'm not sure what an accidental mass shooting is, however. I'm not sure how you do it accidentally, but that's CNN's headline from 2018. You could argue that the media is somewhat obsessed by these things, and you can understand why. These are such emotionally significant events. How could you not cover it? In some way, the media has a responsibility to it, of course. So these are quite frequent sightings on cable news and newspapers to highlight just how impactful mass shootings have been. CNN, deadliest mass shootings in U.S. history, fast facts. Market Watch is involved in it as well. These are the 10 deadliest mass shootings in modern U.S. history. The Washington Post, the LA Times, deadliest U.S. mass shootings 1984 to 2017, implying that they happen with such frequency that we can't escape them. In fact, if you look at the media's role more deeply, what you'll find also is that there's an obsession with the perpetrator, which was highlighted by the fact that very many of you knew who the perpetrators of just these 3 events were, but none of you knew the victims, or very few of you did, right? Here's what we know about the suspect, the New York Times reports in 2017, and I'm not even sure who that suspect was. But last year, the Washington Post, Florida shooting suspect Nicholas Cruz, guns, depression, and a life in trouble. I mean, it's kind of like the media's version of a soap opera. We want to know more about this guy. What made him tick? What made him do what he did? We're fascinated by that. And to some extent, the media is a reflection of how we feel. They give us what we want, right? So it's not just the media. It's how we, as a people, as a culture, look at these things that is worth talking about. There is a bit of a race to the top. The media constantly reports on the mass shootings, but also the number of people killed or injured. There's almost a race to the top. It's as if it's a sporting event that let's see who can cause the most victims in one single event, one single mass shooting, right? Incidentally, I should point out also that mass shootings have been defined differently by different people. Some media outlets define it as simply more than 2 victims, even if they weren't killed. The FBI defines it as at least 3 people killed and others injured. So it all depends on how you define mass shooting in terms of what numbers you come up with, right? But you can see here the top 10 U.S. mass shootings in American history. The 2017 episode in Las Vegas had the most victims, 50 dead. Of course, you've probably seen maps like these on television or in newspaper reports. Entirely, the whole country is lit up with mass shootings, making it appear that they're very, very prevalent. And again, they are increasing. I'll show you a couple of statistics on that later. But that map alone would lead one to believe that they are not only occurring more frequently, but they victimize virtually every state from east to west, north and south, virtually every state. And there are lots of graphs that depict the same thing. Mass shootings from August 1966, one of the worst mass shootings in American history, happened in Texas in that year, all the way to July 23rd, 2015. And this particular chart also depicts not only those who were injured, but those who were killed. So you see the numbers, and if you look closely at the graph, what you see is an uptick in recent years, and I want to talk a little bit about that from a cultural perspective too. But that uptick is significant. It's one of the reasons why the media has concentrated on mass shootings so frequently in recent years. But I would argue, as I'm going to do later, that it's that media coverage that is also likely to produce more mass shootings. There's another graph that looks at the chart in a slightly different way. You can see the area shaded in gray were the years when there was a federal weapons ban, a federal assault weapons ban from the, mid-1990s to the mid-2000s. You'll see also during that time period, there was great fluctuation in mass shootings. But since then, the number of mass shootings have gone up. This is not in terms of the number killed or injured, but just in terms of how many mass shootings there have been in this country. Now, again, it's a tragedy when something like this happens. And I think it's instructive that when Sandy Hook happened a few years back, this traumatized us because it was so close to home. In some sense, I saw up close and personally the trauma. There was a bit of post-traumatic stress disorder that was associated with Sandy Hook just because it was so close to home. And we could only feel for the victims and their families. I actually went to college with one of the victims' mothers. And so obviously it hit close to home. When it's further away, we don't have exactly the same reaction. We tend to look at it from a much more detached point of view, almost as if it's a movie, and we're gripped to the television. Be honest, how many of you cannot tune the television off when a major mass shooting happens? Anybody here? Are you gripped by the whole thing, or are you fascinated by it? Maybe the way I phrased it, very few people would admit it. But I know that it's hard not to look, sort of like when you see a train crashing. You have to look at it. You can't turn away. That's the kind of fascination we tend to have as a people with mass shootings. But what is the likelihood that you will be a victim of mass shooting? It's 0.00005%, according to the best statistics we have. This goes to Bernard, 1999. But even those that have happened more recently, still it's about that small of a percentage. This is according to FBI data, 2014. It has increased slightly, but ever so slightly since 2014. Here's another way of putting what I just said. This is a graph that depicts the mass shootings and how they reduce the life expectancy of the average American compared to various events. And you'll see on the right, if you can't read it, I'm not sure if you can see that, but those are auto accidents in two groupings. If you're a pedestrian involved in an auto accident, or if you're a passenger in a car involved in an auto accident, your life is reduced by 832 hours and 834 hours, respectively. Thank you. By contrast, mass shootings reduce your life expectancy by 13 hours. So it's virtually insignificant. And you can see the comparative detail here, that it's not even close. There are many, many more things in our society to be concerned about. You wouldn't get that sense exactly from the media, from newspapers, and from one another, because we talk about these things much more often than we would care to admit. So just to summarize that point, the rarest of all types of shooting happens in the form of a mass shooting. The smallest number of shooting victims per category is involved in a mass shooting. Mass shootings also create the smallest number of offenders. We could probably all name at least 5 or 6, maybe more, mass shooters for two reasons. Number one, the media covers them ad nauseum, but also because there's so few of them. They're memorable because it doesn't happen often, and the impact they leave and how we cover these events is way out of proportion. You have a better chance of being struck by lightning than by being killed by one of these guys. In fact, a much more serious problem is homicides and suicides by gun. Now, I know that there's at least one of my colleagues in this room, he and I were talking yesterday, guns are a problem in this country, no matter how you slice it, whatever side of the debate you're on, whether you're for gun control, further regulations, whether you support the more absolute form of the Second Amendment. Regardless, we have more guns in our society than there are people, almost, right? And that's far more than many, many countries combined. We have more guns in absolute numbers than any country in the world. So that's an issue. But related to that is the number of homicides by firearms. In 2014 alone, there were more than 11,000 homicides by gun, 69% of all homicides. And a significant problem also are the number of people who take their own lives with a gun. More than 21,000, that's 50% of all suicides. So clearly, we don't concentrate nearly as much on these things than we do on mass shootings for whatever reason, right? I mean, there's virtually at least one person killed by a gun every day in some of the largest cities in the United States, and that is underreported. It's not news anymore because it's so expected, and it doesn't have the glamour and the glitz that a mass shooting does. How about other nations? Sometimes scholars, experts, they offer a comparative analysis between the United States and other countries. Well, even here, the United States is not a country that has the most deaths or victims associated with mass shootings. They do happen with more frequency here, but that's in large measure as a result of the fact that there's so many people who live in the United States. We are a nation, the next census of 2020 is going to show that there are more than 330 million people here, right? What I think more objective scholars do, though, is they compare mass shootings in various countries on a per capita basis. What's per capita mean? Does anyone know? When we look at something per capita, what are we doing? Per million people or per 10,000, whatever the case. So what we're doing, what that means is that we're looking at how many people are killed in a certain way, mass shootings in this case, per 10,000 or per 1 million, right? Because that way you can compare more accurately mass shooting deaths in one country versus another, right? And it's a more helpful way of breaking down the data. So I'm going to give an example of what the United States is often compared to. If you take Norway, for instance, and the United States, right? Sometimes you have experts say, well, Norway and the United States, which one has more mass shootings? And the conclusion is the United States. And that's true in terms of the number of mass shootings. In terms of the number of deaths, Norway, but only because there's been one incident in which 90 people were killed. So even then, scholars tend to say, well, the United States has a much bigger problem than Norway. But you're comparing 5 million people in Norway to more than 330 million people in the United States. That's not comparing apples to apples. A more apt comparison, perhaps, is comparing Norway with Minnesota. Why did I choose Minnesota? Well, because Norway is a fairly homogeneous country. There's not much diversity there, though it is increasing. Minnesota is a fairly homogeneous country, although there is diversity there. But they have about an equal amount of people, an equal number of people. And in Minnesota, you have that much of a chance of being involved in a mass shooting versus Norway. And again, Norway's an outlier because there was that one incident that happened, I don't know, 2012, 2011, I'm not quite sure. But it's helpful to compare things evenly rather than taking countries that are quite different than the United States and much smaller in terms of population. In fact, it's not just Norway, which again is an outlier, but these are countries where there is a greater per capita chance of being a victim of a mass shooting. Macedonia, Belgium, Finland, the Czech Republic, Serbia, Slovakia, and a host of others. This is just a few. The United States is not on top when it comes to the number of casualties. And at least that's worth pointing out, just to give you a further indication of how sometimes we can blow these things out of proportion. As much as these events are increasing, we're talking about a small portion of the deaths that happen by gunfire in this country. So if chances are so low, why do we cover this? I touched on it earlier. There's this fascination that not just media people have, but again, I always point out in my American government courses that the media, in some sense, is a reflection of who we are and what we want to see. They wouldn't bring these things to you if the ratings weren't high. And so when we look at these things as if this were a movie, then the media is going to give us what we want. What I'd like to do, and the reason I'm covering this event today, is to bring awareness to the lack of proportion and how these events impact our lives in relation to how they're covered, to give a sense of the effect that these events have on future mass shootings, and that's an important point I want to make, and also to demonstrate the almost perverse fascination that our culture has with mass shootings. I sometimes compare it to the death penalty. When someone is put to death by lethal injection or electric chair, there's this profound fascination we have with that. Maybe it's just part of the human condition. But the fact of the matter is those two events, in my head anyway, are somewhat parallel. And this is a cultural phenomenon that we need to come to grips with, I think, if we're going to look at this kind of episode from a civically engaged point of view. A major turning point in all of this was what I call the Columbine Effect. How many of you are not familiar with Columbine? Okay. Most people in America are, just because it was such a watershed moment, not just in American criminal history, but in American history broadly. The event, which featured a mass shooting at a high school in Littleton, Colorado, took the lives of, I think, 17 people and injured many more, fascinated us, and it became ingrained in our psyche as a people, as a nation. And it was also captured by the media in real time. And by the way, all you have to do is go to YouTube today and find images and video of it up. And if you look at the number of people who've watched those videos, tens of millions of people, if not more. So it gives you a further indication of how fascinated we are with these kinds of things. But the cultural perspective of Columbine is this. It occurred at a time when the 24-hour news cycle was in full swing. And so you have constant images hitting us and bombarding us and leading us to believe that this is a national epidemic. You also had the rise of cable news, beginning with CNN in the late 1980s, but also extending to MSNBC and Fox News and other outlets by the late 90s. So these cable news companies were covering this event, this Columbine event, all the time. I believe it was for 10 days straight. The Columbine incident also occurred in the wake of major sensationalistic events of the 1990s, and that included the O.J. Simpson car chase and the ensuing trial the following year in 1995. It also included the impeachment of Bill Clinton. And I bring that up not because we can compare a mass shooting with impeachment, but I remember very specifically how people were rushing to get home from work so that they could see what was happening next in the Bill Clinton affair. And they might as well have been watching that event with a bag of popcorn. It's like going to the movies, right? So I think there's something to that that's part of this Columbine effect. And of course, last but not least, this was also the beginning of the internet. While social media had not yet risen to prominence, finding this information online was very easy. And you can also watch videos of it online beginning in the late 20th, early 21st century. More to say about the internet and social media in a minute. This is a graph I thought was interesting. The number of days mass shootings were on the front page of the New York Times. This is just one outlet. You multiply that by the thousands of newspapers across the country and cable news shows, and this is what you have. Columbine gives you a sense of just how frantically it was covered. 10 days straight. Virginia Tech, 6 days. Some were shorter spans of time than others. Now, one of the things that I think is very positive that has come out of these events is, if you look at Parkland, which was a year ago today, it was covered for 16 days straight, not only because of the graphic nature of what happened in Florida, but especially because of the student activism. And I think that is a very positive thing that's come out of this. Regardless of which side of the political aisle you're on, whether these young people know what they're talking about in terms of gun control or not, they're getting active. And that's an important point to make. Whenever there's a problem or a perceived societal problem, people need to get active. They can't wait for others to do it. Okay, and so I applaud the Parkland activists for doing what they're doing, because they kept the story going and they shaped the narrative. That's an important discussion that's related to all of this. Scholars refer to something else as the media contagion effect. A contagion is something that spreads, like a disease, right? But mass shooters themselves, which I think I've demonstrated, have a fascination for. They know they will be covered ubiquitously, every day, for days straight. Researchers have found that in high-profile mass shootings, there was a statistically significant contagion effect. In other words, when there's a mass shooting, it's likely that another one will follow in a short span of time. They've made that link. And it's a causal link. It's not just a correlation, it's causal. Studies have shown that those who commit these acts are more likely to be men. In their lives, they have felt, in some sense, in their own mind, emasculated or humiliated, embarrassed. They perceive themselves to be weak in relation to other members of society. And as a result, they need to reclaim their sense of power over their own lives and control over the lives of others. Research has indicated this point as well. And that's the best way they know how to become celebrities in our society. I think we all know that in order to be a celebrity in the United States, in American culture, you don't need to be a good person, right? That's pretty well established, right? But you do need to be notorious in some way or popular in some way, right? They are celebrities in their own minds, but also in the minds of others. How do we know this? Well, I'll show you in a minute, but it goes without saying that there are dozens of fan pages on the internet devoted to these killers. The media, what's its role? It gives these killers a platform in which to do this. According to one 2016 study, the media encourages what it calls a cult of celebrity. This is a more significant cause of mass shootings than either mental health status or access to guns. Now again, I'm not here to tell you that we shouldn't limit access to guns or that we shouldn't focus on mental health as an issue here. Those are separate discussions. But I'm here to say that the way we look at these perpetrators is significant, because that in turn affects the way they perceive themselves. And of course, that leads us to copycat shootings. This is from the ISA Institute of Labor Economics, which found that there is a positive and statistically significant effect of coverage on the number of shootings that happen later. So whenever a mass shooting happens, there is much more likely of an instance for another one to happen within 4 to 10 days of a mass shooting. At its mean, news coverage is suggested to cause approximately 3 mass shootings in the following week, which means that there's a 58% chance. Well, this explains that there's a 58% increase in mass shootings because of these copycats. Now, if you look at the shooters themselves, the records indicate that they model their behavior on past shooters. One of the reasons many of you may have heard of Dylan Klebold is because he's become this cult figure, not among us, but among a certain select group of people in the United States. And he is referenced, especially Dylan Klebold, more so than the other perpetrator at Columbine, Eric Harris. Klebold is referenced numerous times in subsequent mass shootings. The Columbine shooters left a manifesto, so that made their actions in the minds of some even more glamorous, even more romanticized. A 2015 shooter who murdered 2 people live on television. You may have seen the event on TV. There were reporters reporting on the news, and he killed them. While the cameras were going, he said, "I've noticed that so many people like me are all alone and unknown. Yet when we spill a little blood, the whole world knows who we are. A man was known by no one is now known by everyone. Seems like the more people you kill, the more you're in the limelight." Fandemonium, this may be perhaps the most bizarre aspect of mass shootings and the cultural reaction we tend to have, but these mass shooters, much like serial killers, they have fans. This is a phenomenon that's been going on for many, many, many decades. The South Florida Sun-Sentinel on March 28th, just about a month and a half after the Parkland shootings, reported that crazed girls are flooding Parkland shooter Nicholas Cruz with fan mail. Mass murderer Nicholas Cruz is getting stacks of fan mail and love letters sent to the Broward County Jail, along with hundreds of dollars in contributions to his commissary account. A teenager wrote to Nicholas Cruz in March of 2018, and she said, "I'm 18 years old. I'm a senior in high school. When I saw your picture on the television, something attracted me to you." So what does that mean culturally for us? Why would someone who otherwise, I'm sure, leads a normal life be attracted to one of these perpetrators? Social media, you say. Well, we're going to look at that. Yes?
Some people don't exactly know potentially how serious the situation actually is because it doesn't affect them necessarily.
Right.
For one, and for two, say they were raised in a household that was raised very strict or something to that effect, perhaps they see that as freedom. Whether it's good, bad, and different doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to think any less of it. It's kind of like those individuals, like when Osama bin Laden, him and his buddies, to say the least, constructed the 9/11 attacks. People still appreciated the fact of the knowledge base that went into it. People studied the mind because they wanted to know how he thought. Why did it happen? So it doesn't happen again, but on the same side of it, we do the same thing when we go into another country. We have to know how they work, why they work. I'm sure there's agencies out there doing the same thing to us and appreciate our work. They may be mad because of the situation that adheres to it, but they can still appreciate the intelligence that went behind it, and something like that could perhaps be what's happening.
Right, so you made a lot of good points. There's a lot to unpack there, but one of the first things you said is that in their own mind, they're attracted from a distance. They're not emotionally connected to it in terms of being a victim. A lot like going to see a movie, and we identify with celebrities in the movie theater in the same manner. And again, there's a lot psychologically there that we can talk about. But I just think it's fascinating that a certain sub-segment of our society perceives the perpetrators in this manner. Social media does, in fact, make it possible for these people to communicate with one another. So you have a community of fans on social media sites, which just adds fuel to the fire. So I do want to explore the effect of social media. What you see here, both graphs depict in one form or another just how many more users there are on social media today than, say, a few years ago. If you look at it over a 10-year period, I have numbers that go up to 2012 and 2011 respectively. But if you were to look at it for another 5 years, that line would go completely up. This particular graph traces Facebook in relation to things like MySpace. I don't know what happened to MySpace. Everyone was on MySpace 10 years ago. It's just gone now. But it's been replaced by other forms of social media like Facebook, like Twitter, Instagram, and others that I've never even heard of and that seem to be popping up every day. So one thing that we can establish pretty conclusively is that social media use has skyrocketed over the last 10, 12 years. This is my own graph. Here's a correlation, not necessarily a causal effect, but a correlation between the rise of social media over the last dozen years or so and the number of mass shootings that have occurred over the last 10, 12 years or so. Now again, it's up to further studies to determine whether there is a causal link, but there is a relationship of some kind, it seems, between the rise of social media and the increased number of mass shootings. Social media may build a community of mass murderers. A little bit more on this. There's actually a phenomenon known as the Columbine obsessed Tumblr bloggers. There are bloggers on Tumblr that are devoted to the Columbine killers. It's a fan page, and they communicate. They bounce ideas off of each other. And while it's fairly well established that most people on there are not criminals, the fact that they're talking about it is suggestive enough for a cultural phenomenon in our society. Also, according to FBI files, Adam Lanza, that's the perpetrator of the Sandy Hook shooting, his social media communications with others gave him meaning. It gave him a sense of purpose. And I suspect that's the same thing with fans. Like the girl who wrote Nicholas Cruz the love letter. Writing that love letter gave her a sense of purpose, much like Adam Lanza himself. He had different names on his Tumblr accounts. And he named those accounts after previous mass shooters. So it's these forums in particular, not just the news media, but these forums that glorify video games, which creates more of a cult of celebrity for these shooters. Video games like Super Columbine Massacre RPG. I'd never heard of that before I started doing research for this event. I'm sorry? It's a role-playing game. Yeah, that's what RPG stands for, right? And so you're, according to what I've read, you become the shooter. And there was another video game called School Shooter that Adam Lanza played on the internet. Nicholas Cruz, for his part, he left a very disturbing digital footprint that others have glamorized ever since in the last year. So what I tried to do in this presentation when I was conceiving of how to present it to you was to give you the broader cultural outlook, not just to talk about the guns, not just to talk about the violence and the news media. I wanted to make it bigger than that. And one of the things that sociologists, historians, and others explore is a sense of social isolation that seems to become inevitable with modern society. So there's an irony to Western civilizations in the 21st century. The more people that are around us that we communicate with on social media, the more isolated we become. Maybe as a group, we can explore that in a minute or two. But modern societies produce this sense of isolation, not just the United States. This is a phenomenon that goes back to after World War II, even indeed at the beginning of the 20th century. And this sense of isolation contributes to violence among a small percentage of the population. Social media, I think we can argue, accelerates, it exacerbates the decline in community, and it further increases the sense of alienation. One study has referred to Columbine as the starting point for disenchanted youth who see their loneliness almost as a badge of honor. A recent study of 1,787 adults aged 19 to 32 showed that those who spent more time on social media reported more frequent isolation. And the studies indicate that the average American spends anywhere from 5 to 7 hours on social media every day. 5 to 7 hours every day. We don't realize it because we're constantly doing this. Ding. That adds up if you do it hundreds of times a day. So we put it down, we pick it up, we put it down, we pick it up. But according to studies, 5 to 7 hours a day on social media. And unfortunately, from my point of view, we're not on there to build community. If we were, we'd be using it in a much more positive way. And of course, social isolation leads to alienation. Now, what is alienation? It means that you become detached from society, from its values. You become unanchored. You're not grounded anymore. And this causes some who are already troubled to commit heinous acts, such as mass shootings, maybe even homicides as well. A lot of criminal activity can perhaps be explained in terms of this sense of alienation. How many of you have ever read Catcher in the Rye? Okay, one of the main themes of that book, which I assign occasionally in my U.S. since 45 course, is alienation. Holden Caulfield feels completely detached from everyday society. He rejects his own class of people. He rejects wealth. He rejects everything about America, capitalism. He rejects the idea of community. What's the most often used word in Catcher in the Rye, if you've read it recently? Everybody's a phony. That's what modern society may produce, the sense of superficiality that leads to alienation. If everyone's phony, why bother? Why do we need to associate with these people? Let's just detach ourselves. And again, a certain subsegment of the population, this will have a very, very negative effect on. So I would say that, just to wrap up, we should try our best not to give in to these kind of baser instincts. We should not glamorize or glorify these occurrences. That would be a helpful starting point. This is an issue that requires, I would say, a comprehensive multi-level solution. We should look at gun control. We should look at mental health. We should look at race as a means of dealing with this issue, of class. I mean, across the board. Unfortunately, when politicians deal with these issues, number one, they just contribute to the over-emotionalism of it. And number two, they argue only their point of view. We need less guns. We need gun regulation. We need more mental health focus. Why don't we need all of these things? Why don't we build a comprehensive solution? And that's true for every political problem. They often require comprehensive solutions where both sides get a little bit of what they want, but nobody gets everything of what they want. That's what the art of compromise is. That's what politics is all about. Thank you very much. I know I ended that abruptly, but I'm done. So. But I wanted to leave some time for questions and comments. Feel free to pass this around if you have any questions or comments, but I'd be happy to not only try to address your questions or comments, but if we can kind of have a conversation, an interactive conversation, that would be helpful too. So does anyone want to start?
I wonder how in a free society we begin to attack these issues in terms of how do you deal with folks who have mental health problems who also have the rights to live the life the way they want? How do you deal with gun control in a country where we have a Second Amendment right to protect ourselves?
Well, when I was looking at the data internationally, what you find is that China has had no mass killings. And that's because it's largely an authoritarian society, where crime is punished very swiftly and very severely. And so, I'm sorry? Well, and I was just going to say, those numbers can be off as well, but I'm willing to bet that the numbers are pretty sharply reduced because of authoritarianism. So in other words, to pick up on William's point, the more freedom a society has, the more likely that these events may happen. I mean, there's not an exact causal relationship, but the degree of freedom we have, we are one of the few societies that has a Second Amendment. And that degree of freedom alone can help to explain why these things happen. And as I said earlier, we have guns very readily at our disposal. And that's a reflection of our freedom. So I think that is a problem that we need to contend with. And I'm not suggesting we need to be more authoritarian. I think we should cherish our freedoms. Any other comments or questions?
I have a booming voice.
You do.
How do you think that the 24-hour news cycle has, because when I was growing up, I'm going to date myself, right? You had news at 6 o'clock with an anchor that was pretty well trusted, few networks, and they told you the news. And then the following morning, you'd read the paper, and you'd go through your whole entire day, you know, not exposed to all the news. But once, and I don't mean to blame CNN, but that was the first network that really gave us news 24 hours a day. And if you look at CNN when it first started, it was someone behind a desk giving news, and then all of a sudden the ticker appeared, racing across the bottom. Then all of a sudden on the sidebar, they were giving you news, and it's become more complex. So how do you think that contributed to, in addition to social media?
Well, the short answer is greatly. I mean, the 1990s in terms of the 24-hour news cycle was a major turning point in all of this. What I was going to play earlier, but I think is more appropriate now since you asked the question, is a clip from CNN. And I'm just going to let it run for about a minute and a half or so. And I just want to get your thoughts on what you think about this particular coverage of Parkland in the immediate aftermath of that incident. Your thoughts, just given what I said, Molly? Right.
To have an emotional reaction to it.
Now, a follow-up question. Do you think that's a fair way of analyzing what just happened at Parkland? So it happened that very day or the day after. So in some sense, you can't blame him, right? But what are your thoughts on that tack?
I mean, I don't think it's fair to
Okay.
me. I don't think it's fair. I think you should let the families grieve and then eventually get the rest of the population to grieve.
Okay.
I think the families need their own time
Okay.
and then get the population to grieve as well.
Now, keep in mind, in reference to Professor Machado's question, the 24-hour news cycle repeats this kind of emotional response over and over and over and over again. So I'm wondering what impact that has on just everyday people like you and I, right? Yes, and then we'll get to Paul.
I would say part of the reason why I feel like there needs to be, they really emphasize this really emotional aspect to it is like I feel like a lot of news, even if it's just like political coverage or coverage of tragedies like this where things happen that, I feel like, at least for myself, I get emotionally fatigued. I get burnt out on it. And after a while, the first time you're like, oh my gosh. And then a third time you're like,
Right.
oh man, 10th time you're like, ah, shucks.
Yeah. Does it give you a sense of despair? Like, my
Yeah.
goodness, we're
And
next.
So,
He said it himself, we're next.
yeah, and I feel like, so in order for news agencies like this to keep people interested, to keep people tuning on for 6 days in a row, you have to plant people's emotions because once you lay out the facts, people are like,
Right.
okay.
Well-
So you have to keep people like really engaged, really emotional, really invested in it to keep it going.
Any composition teacher will tell you, if you want to write a good essay, what do you do first? You appeal to the emotions, and that gets people hooked, and that's what he's trying to do. So you raise very good points, and I like the wording you used, emotional fatigue, to the point where we're so tired, we become helpless. We don't know what to do about it as a response. And certainly, emotion is the opposite of reason. And again, it's not, the people who experience this directly, the victims, horrible. How could you not be? I mean, you're devastated forever. But from an empirical perspective, is this the right way of handling this? Paul, I know you have your hand up.
Well, a couple of things. Not to absolve cable news from their
You wouldn't
responsibility.
do that, would
No,
you?
of course not. But the fact of the matter is what he's doing here any different from what any politician does
Not
in
at
these
all.
circumstances?
No way. No
All
way. I
right,
could
and the other
include the
thing,
politicians in there, too.
and I got to be honest with you, too, we talk about cable news adding to the mystique of the mass shooter and everything like that, but again, to me, that's a symptom, because our
Okay.
relationship with, look at how much hero worship there was for like Billy the Kid or Jesse James. I
Absolutely.
mean,
This is nothing
been a
new,
cultural
right.
thing for as long as our country has been in
Right.
existence.
John Wayne.
So to think we can kind of root it out now, that horse has already left the barn, so
Sure,
to speak.
sure.
And I just think, like I say, you know how I feel about cable news to start with.
Yeah.
But let's not look at cable news.
As the culprit.
As the
Okay.
culprit.
No, that's fair, and I like the reference to Billy the Kid. I didn't think Billy the Kid would be coming up in this conversation today. But you're right, there's a continuum of the public's fascination with these kinds of people who go against the grain, against the law.
Yeah, yeah. I honestly, to be honest with you, and I don't want to get off on too much of a political tangent, but a lot of it has to do with the nature of the system that we've created here. You
Okay.
know what I mean?
Yep,
And there's eventually, when you see the 1% getting away with murder time and time again, and yet the people in the lower classes are the ones that keep getting nailed and paying for the prices of their sins, of
Right.
course you're gonna have a bit of a blow up as far as the lower classes go. or
makes
whatever
sense,
you wanna
right,
call
in
it,
that
you
context,
know?
sure. Yeah, AJ.
Okay. Sometimes the best response to combat noise is calculated and intentional silence.
Okay.
But in this case, the multi-tier solution, in my opinion, is legalizing the $300 billion drug industry revenue, so it is taken off the black market and put into a multitude of diverse social services and healthcare solutions. My second tier would be create a news channel that shares the positive information in local towns and states and districts. Simple facts, resources available in the local area, phone lines and websites for donations to victims' families, and support services. Report on the positive happenings within community centers and resources, and fundraising events for civic engagement promotions.
And I have said that any better. I mean, the second point, the first point, I'm not sure how to.
It's complicated.
Okay, but the first point, how about having a news station or a newspaper devoted entirely to positive things that revolve around civic engagement? If I find, am I summing up correctly?
That's basically the summary, is
Yeah.
you want to combat the dark noise with
Right.
light noise.
But I think it's also incumbent upon us to develop an interest in positive news, because one of the reasons the media reports these negative things is because we are kind of gripped by those things. But if we can retrain our brains to focus on positive community work that's being done, then I think we'd go a long way in combating this kind of phenomenon.
I think people are there on an individual level, they just don't have an outlet on a global or group level. So people individually work on mindfulness and mental health as individuals, but they don't have a collective to flock towards. There's
Okay.
always going to be that interest in Ted Bundy and
Right.
thousands of people as execution and sending them
Sure.
love letters, because there's a word for it, a fascination. But it doesn't have to be like that for everybody.
Sure. Excellent point. Yes, Louis. Yeah, Louis.
I'd like to make a statement first, and then I'd like to ask a question.
Sure.
But I think there's probably not many of us here that know where the term going postal comes from, originates from.
Right.
But I'll give you a quick history lesson. In the late 80s and early 90s, we had a rash of postal workers who killed their coworkers. And the term going postal derived from that, which basically means somebody goes in and goes postal, kills a bunch of people. Now, the end result of that was that there was a significant investigation done by the Postal Service into the cause of those atrocities. And what they found out was that they had a toxic work environment where those people had used whatever means they had at their level to try to resolve problems that they were having at work, and there was no help for those people. And so they got to a point where the work environment was so toxic that they felt that that was the answer. Killing their coworkers, and most of them killed their bosses, I believe, and killed coworkers
And
as well.
people
But
in
the
that
boss,
area.
right, was usually their supervisor was the main target. Now, so the Postal Service kind of answered that question. What created those situations? And so the question I have is, these are things that are happening in our school systems, and I hear a lot of talk about mental health and gun control. But why isn't the question being answered, what has happened in our school systems in the past 25, 30 years that has made children who want to kill other children? Why isn't that question being asked? Because it was asked at the Postal Service level, and they did make changes to how employees could, file a complaint or do whatever. And, I see we have in schools now no tolerance, no bullying, and I really see that somewhat as a disservice to our kids, because what we're doing to young children and to young adults is taking away their ability to resolve conflict on their own.
No
And
doubt.
that's a huge issue. When you can't resolve conflict on your own and you don't have those conflict resolution skills, and when they're taken from you or you don't get to learn that, that causes problems, I think, later on for young adults who don't have those skills. And then they feel that, sure, this stuff is glorified, and that contributes to that somewhat, but those are important skills to have.
Absolutely.
And I guess, yeah, that's my question. Why aren't we asking that question?
Right. Well, a couple of points. Number one, I recall very specifically the idea of going postal and the many acts of violence that were committed in the workplace. Unfortunately, a lot of those people who perpetrated those acts were associated with the Vietnam War. These were Vietnam veterans, and not all of them were, but that was the stereotype that emerged. So a lot of it had to do with PTSD and so on. But yeah, and the Postal Service did conduct an investigation. As having a brother who works as a postal worker today, I can tell you there's still some major problems with it. But anyway, that's another matter entirely. But the second point, the point about bullying is an important one. I don't think we give our kids the tools they need to combat just meanness and just bad behavior, to combat bullying. I think I couldn't have said it better, so I totally agree with you. Now, how you do that is another matter. I don't know that there's a policy that can be put in place. I think it's parental, and I think one of the things that makes these kinds of things more likely is the breakdown of families, and even among middle-class families, because in some ways, this is a middle-class phenomenon. If you look at it by class, it tends to be the middle classes, and it tends to be white men in particular who commit these acts. So I think there's something to what you're saying, and that's for another day of full discussion. But excellent point. Okay, let's get to someone who's not said anything. Yeah.
I wouldn't blame the 24-hour, I hate these things, the 24-hour coverage. You just mentioned Vietnam. It's the first time a war was ever shown in the States in color.
Correct.
We were therefore desensitized to it, and people have used words infatuated, obsessed with. That combined with the general tenor of culture, what's going on in games, pornography, TV, movies, what we're okay with, that's certainly changed the overall cultural paradigm for everyone, ages 5 to 70, what you're okay with. What was rated R in 1971 would be PG now.
If that, right.
I mean,
I don't know if you can hear him back there, but
it's the reality of what it is. From you mentioned Ted Bundy, we have Charlie Manson, God bless him, he's always good for a hoax, but I mean, these are people we've grown to idolize that are given the media's attention because, like every other caption, free sex sells, that's the period. It's,
Right.
if you grab
Right.
them,
no, excellent points again. I believe that as far as becoming desensitized to violence, that's absolutely right, and it's ingrained in our pop culture. I once, in my U.S. since 1945 course, showed Psycho, the film, the original, the best one, because the other since then it pale in comparison. But And I told them, this is going to be very suspenseful for you. And this was maybe 5 years ago. They didn't find this to be a big deal at all. This is just is phony violence. It wasn't realistic. It didn't faze them. But in 1957, when that movie came out, it was absolutely terrifying to people. So yeah, the pendulum has swung way in this direction in terms of what we are sensitive to, in terms of violence. And there are lots of cultural reasons for that, including, the wars we've been involved in. Vietnam, as you mentioned, was the first televised war, and I think that desensitized us to war. It's a very famous photograph of the Vietnam War. An American soldier's walking, and he's looking to his right, and he sees a dead fellow soldier, and it doesn't faze him. And I used that in my Vietnam War class as a reflection of the fact that, once you see war, and we have seen it up close and personally in modern times, then it's not a big deal anymore. And that, in part, explains why violence in movies, what you said is absolutely right. What used to be rated R is at most, PG-13. So, anyway, we have time for maybe one or two more comments, or we can call it a day. Your choice. Yes?
Comment on the schools taking responsibility to teach kids problem resolution, conflict. I think that's too high a bar.
I didn't say it was the school's responsibility.
Okay.
I just posed the question of, that, when I was a kid
Yeah.
in school, and I'm much older than probably most everybody here, but when I was a kid in school, you had a fight in the playground.
Sure.
You shook hands after.
Sure.
You know what I mean? You had a disagreement, you worked out some way. Sometimes you could work it out verbally, sometimes you couldn't work it out verbally.
Right.
But we had the ability to resolve those conflicts.
Yeah.
And get involved in that kind of thing. And it's interesting that you said this is a middle class issue, right? Because one of the other things that I've noticed is, yes, it is a middle class issue. And there's a lot more conflict and a lot more conflict resolution in lower classes than there is in the middle class.
There's no doubt about
And you
it.
don't see those people.
Okay.
You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I kind of.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you at all.
See it as the school's responsibility,
I don't either. That was going to be my point.
our ability to do that.
Right.
With their policies.
Well, my point was going to be that I don't think we can expect schools to take on that responsibility, and teachers aren't social workers, they're not psychologists, they're not police officers. That has to be done. To follow up on your comment, that kind of behavior has to be taught at home. It has to be a family responsibility. I think we expect too much from our schools today, to be honest with you.
Yeah. It's interesting, though. It is a middle-class phenomenon. By the way, any sociology teacher will tell you which class of people has the highest rates of suicide. Middle class. Right? It's not the poor, right? I think in part because of what you're saying, that conflict resolution. Now, I was born and raised purely working-class poor, right? And we used to call it ranking. We used to rank on each other in Buckley High School, too. And it was no big deal. People would tear into you, and you learned how to deal with it, right? But now, my kids are middle-class kids, and I have to catch myself sometimes. And the messages they get around them, in schools also, by the way, but in society at large, is we have to be sensitive to your feelings. We have to make sure that no one bullies you. And sometimes I want to say, you know what, that's true, that was mean. And then I say, wait a minute, suck it up. Because that's what we had to do, and we know how to manage conflict better as a result, right? And I know some people in this room may disagree with that. I know, because the temptation is to want to coddle our kids. It is, absolutely.
We want our children to have a better life than we did.
Right.
But by doing that, we do them a disservice because they don't have the experiences, the difficult experiences that they need to succeed.
Absolutely. No doubt about it. AJ, did you have your hand? For them. I'm sorry, Dr. Lucas, you said? Okay. Okay, interesting. So I hope above all that we introduced like an interdisciplinary perspective. We've covered a lot of things from criminal justice to psychology to sociology to history. So it was worth it just in that regard.
What I
You
was,
get the last comment.
ooh, I get to end the whole show. What I was going to say is kind of to piggyback on your bullying comment on how schools approach it, is that through no fault of their own, in many cases, parents are often overwhelmed with how to keep track of what their kids are doing. So, I mean, I have a 16-year-old son and a 12-year-old daughter, and keeping track of how they can communicate with each other is a full-time job. Okay, like there's a gaming network called Steam where they go and they play games. Steam, S-T-E-A-M. Okay, so they're playing games, and they have internet access because our house has Wi-Fi, right? Well, there's a messaging aspect on these games, and they can message each other and become friends. Well, there's a whole sub-messaging area of this that if you don't know about it, you don't know to check it, right? So who's bullying who, who's saying what to who? You know, years ago, I mean, I'm 45 years old, but my parents had an easier job of it monitoring what I did because I didn't have access to communicate with everybody the way they do. You know, so now I have to be an expert on all of the ways they can bully each other or say mean things to each other. And I think that parents, even the ones who want to do a good job at it, sometimes fail at it. And then the schools kind of step in and try to bridge that gap in a lot of ways. And so I don't think intentionally schools want to do this, but I think it's like a reaction to just what's happening.
Social media definitely just seems to make every problem worse somehow. I don't know, it's supposed to be a source of good, but I don't know that it's materialized that way over the last decade. So we will see. Should have been, right. For those of you who don't know, that's Paul Hardy, our resident capitalist. He loves capitalism and everything associated with it.
That's the problem. I don't have a problem with capitalism.
It's point well taken. All right. You two should have a beer, is what he's saying. Thank you all very much for coming. I totally appreciate your comments and questions and for being here.